Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Ready? Welcome. How's everybody tonight?
Good.
Good to see you all. If you're not aware, you probably are because you got that information when you came in, but we are doing elections tonight, so if you don't mind staying after, we'll have some announcements and election business to take care of right after the presentation, but we don't want to hold up the good, interesting stuff. I think a lot of you probably know our presenter tonight is Bob Schrage. He has been on many boards and involved in helping tell the history of this county and this region. He has written many interesting books, of which there are on that table for sale if anybody would like to take one home today. He tonight is going to do a topic that I was really excited that he proposed to do because I think it's always fascinating to see what's going on in our past politics. Then we don't have to worry about what's going on right now. Right? So tonight we're going to hear a little bit about the hidden history of Kentucky's political scandals from Bob Schrage, who is one of our favorite writers and local historians. So help me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much, Hillary. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here today and see a lot of old friends and stuff. In some ways, to my chagrin, I moved out. I lived in Rabbit Hash for 20 years, and at my age, bought an old historic 3-story house built in 1895, which makes absolutely no sense at all, but we did it, and we like it a lot. It's in Dayton, Kentucky. It's close to downtown and all that kind of stuff. But I always miss Rabbit Hash and stuff. And in fact, Rabbit Hash, the election of the dog as a mayor of Rabbit Hash is sort of based on political corruption in the sense that the whole thing is you buy the votes. And you buy the votes for the dog, and then usually somebody comes in at the last minute probably and throws in a whole bunch of money, and the election is won and great. So I'm going to talk about the hidden history of Kentucky political scandals. I have to apologize at the start of the presentation because my co-author, John Schaaf, was going to be here today. And when you write a book with another author, generally speaking, what you do is you divide up the chapters and stuff. Well, he wrote a couple fascinating chapters on the Bob scandal, which you may recall, in our more recent history, the assassination of Goebel, which is a great chapter in the book, just about his assassination and stuff. I'm going to touch on those a little bit, but he's really the expert on those things. And we booked the night, and then his wife surprised him with a cruise this weekend. So I thought about asking him to, zoom in for the cruise, and I figured I wouldn't go over real well. So, but this book came about. The publisher actually called me about this concept that they had been wanting to do one on Kentucky political scandals. Now, the publisher's out of South Carolina, and the fact that they wanted to focus on Kentucky doesn't say a whole lot. When I first started to think about the book, I thought, well, this is going to be like War and Peace. This is going to be a really big book and stuff like that. But it really wasn't. It's only this big and stuff. But so they told me about this book, and then I started out to just find out who in the world is going to be an expert on this topic that I can really talk to. And I talked to a couple of legislators who I knew well, and I talked to Trey Grayson, who some of you may know, used to be the Secretary of State, and all three of them said you need to talk to John Schaaf. John used to be the head of the Kentucky Legislative Ethics Commission, so he was here during the Bob scandal and some of the modern scandals that we'll talk about toward the end of the presentation. And I met with him at lunch at Georgetown, and within 5 minutes I knew I got a co-author, with this person. I mean, he really needs to be a part of the book. So the book really ranges from about 1792, which of course we know is statehood. So the first political scandal really, involves before statehood. And you know that business and government can be, just human nature can lead to political scandals. And those scandals in Kentucky history have really produced a whole lot of colorful characters, and in some cases, legal reforms that led to sort of hopefully building some trust and getting rid of some future scandals. And so we'll talk a little bit about the last chapter in this book talks about political reform. Kentucky has gone from one of the most corrupt states in the nation to really being on, and it has been for decades now, on the leading edge of good government, of good ethics laws and stuff, both at the state level and the local level. We'll talk about that. But in this book, we really try to focus in on sort of those really unusual and sort of some of the cases are just outrageous examples that Kentucky playing politics. So that's what we try to do, and it's unfair and inaccurate to label all politicians and all these people as unethical. I mean, I've worked with elected officials for decades and decades and stuff, and there are just many people who are very admirable. And it's also true that Kentucky is not necessarily the worst state in the nation for political corruption. I mean, just think of Illinois, and I made my point, Chicago and Mayor Daley, and all that kind of stuff. So, so we're not necessarily the worst state, but we're going to find out we were pretty bad. So I'm going to. Like I said, the first real ethical thing started out before statehood, 1792, and it was one of those things that as Kentucky was part of what? Virginia at the time, and people came from Virginia and Pennsylvania and North Carolina to Kentucky, and would have been really big during that time, of course, were land surveyors. And so the real first political corruption was before statehood, and it had to do with land surveyors coming. They would, in a nutshell, they would issue warrants, but issued warrants, and that, but land had to, for that to be valid, you had to have a specific piece of parcel of land that went with it. Well, these surveyors would charge people with double fees, and they'd have a year to pay it off if they didn't pay it off. For example, the surveyor in Lexington, which was very corrupt, and he really is sort of first public official, I guess, for corruption. He would make a note 1 year from that date. He would swoop in because he knew whose bills were due for the land, and he'd swoop them and put them in his name and stuff like that. So land surveyors were the first corruption. However, I'm going to talk about this person first. And his name is James Wilkinson. Some of you may have heard of him. And I think Wilkinson Boulevard in Frankfurt is named after him. He is one of the most controversial figures in the early years of Kentucky and the nation. He was born in Maryland, but he then came to Kentucky. He was commissioned a captain in the American Army, and he served with Nathaniel Greene in the early part of his career, and he had a very successful military career in the Revolutionary War. He did become an aide to Benedict Arnold, but that's not really, you might say, well, that's where it started. Well, it really isn't. He, along with a person by the name of Gates, were very instrumental in the Battle of Saratoga. And Gates said to Wilkinson, hey, you go to Congress and talk to him about the Battle of Saratoga. Well, he went to that, and he overplayed his role in the battle. He waited, he made Congress wait, a whole bunch of stuff that didn't sit well. But he did such a good job explaining his role, which was completely overstated, that he was promoted to a brigadier general. And then that's when his sort of long history of deceit started. He was promoted over more senior people, and then he was very instrumental in a controversy or a conspiracy to replace George Washington as with Horatio Gates as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Now, can you imagine that? This Kentuckian wanted to replace George Washington. Now, as a result of that, he had to resign. But you know, in Kentucky, his Revolutionary War record was just outstanding. But to make a long story short, there were, around statehood, there were two viable options. Kentucky stays part of Virginia, or Kentucky becomes a new state. But there really was a third one that Wilkinson was advocating. He wanted Kentucky to become part of the Spanish Empire and not be an independent state. And so, and in fact, in 1787, he traveled to New Orleans, met with the governor of the Spanish territory, and he demanded a pension, he demanded money, and he said he could deliver Kentucky to the Spanish Empire. And then he got money. He became he convinced the governor of that. And he said he could control commerce from Kentucky down the river to the Mississippi Valley, down to the Mississippi Valley, and he could control all the trade from Kentucky. So he got a trade monopoly and stuff, and then he controlled all of the goods leaving Kentucky. At home, he would advocate in Kentucky for separation of both Kentucky and Virginia from the Union. Now, eventually, as you know, in 1792, we became part of the Union, and then he sort of began his second military career. And you know, he fought the Indians, he did these other things. And George Washington, looking for a new general of the army, didn't appoint him, but he made him second in command. So General Washington put in a traitor as second in command of the United States Army. That Spanish spy, he was a Spanish spy, now held the #2 post in the U.S. Army. Well, the guy named Wayne, who was appointed the top person, died. And then Wilkinson was appointed to the top person in the United States Army, and he was a traitor. He even later became, I mean, a couple things he did. I mean, he would, you know, being the #1 person, he would tell the Spanish about American Army troop movements. I mean, he even later tipped them off to the Lewis and Clark expedition and stuff like that. So he was not a good person. I think it was years later, Teddy Roosevelt said he's the most despicable person in American history. So he was even big on the Burr conspiracy, which was to pervade. You know, he wanted Jefferson to. Burr tried to persuade Jefferson to appoint Wilkinson governor of the Louisiana Territory. And it was a big conspiracy because, you know, Burr was not a great upstanding person either. And in the Burr conspiracy, Wilkinson then turned on Burr, even though it was both of them together. And he told Jefferson about Burr's activities and stuff, and then so he was a traitor to even his cohorts and stuff like that. So anyway, he went by the name Agent 13. He actually even had a name. But anyway, he eventually, you know, really became the first major political scandal in Kentucky. He was not a great person. Another person I just briefly introduced you to is Governor Joseph Disha. Now, he was the 9th governor of Kentucky. He served 4 years, of course. During that time, there wasn't succession. And, you know, of the 50-some governors that the state of Kentucky had, he's probably one of the worst governors that Kentucky's ever had. Well, there was a guy named Francis Baker, was bludgeoningly murdered in Kentucky in 1825. And this helps make Disha the worst governor. The person who was put on trial for the murder was the governor's son. Well, the governor was obviously very well connected and stuff. Baker was robbed and murdered. He was killed with bull whip and a knife. And prior to the start of the 1825 trial, the governor had it moved to his home county. The judge was, Pegleg Shannon was his name, and he was a friend of the governor. So the judge of the case was a good friend of the governor's. Isaac's attorney was a friend of the governor, and he was a member of the state's highest court. And at that time it wasn't the Supreme Court, I think it was called the Fourth Court of Appeals. Well, they found the governor's son guilty of murder, and then the judge, the governor's friend, decided that the evidence was tainted, so nothing. And that caused widespread public anger in the state of Kentucky. And a new trial was held, but he was found guilty again. And then when he was found guilty, his son tried to commit suicide. And it didn't look like he was going to live, so what did the governor do? What do you think he did? He pardoned his son. You know, I mean, that sounds like what we go on. I think Donald Trump and Joe Biden both pardoned relatives and stuff, so it still goes on. And he pardoned his son. His son lived, and he left the state and committed another murder in Texas. So, you know, that really is the first gubernatorial scandal in this state's history. I don't think this next picture. No. I wanted to mention the shooting of William Towby. Now, Kentucky Scandals has a lot of violence in it. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But there was a guy named Charles Kincaid who was a Louisville Times correspondent who, in 1868, published an article that Kentucky Congressman Towby was found in a compromising position in the U.S. Patent Office with a young woman. So obviously, sex is part of scandals, and we have that in Kentucky. And that meant the end of Tawby's congressional and his political career. So over the next couple of years, Tawby and Kincaid would see each other in the Capitol because Kincaid became a lobbyist. Tawby became a lobbyist. Kincaid was a reporter. And so they would see each other all the time. And Tawby would come across him, and he'd always threaten Kincaid. In fact, he'd always pull his ears. If he was walking by, he'd do all this silly kind of stuff. But more than anything, he would always threaten him. So, and Tawby was very very strapped. I can't come up with the word, but he was very physically fit. And Kincaid was not. He was a very meek kind of a person. Well, one day, they passed each other this one day, and Tawby threatened Kincaid, and Kincaid said, "I'm in no mood to fight," and so they didn't. But then later, they ran into each other. Kincaid actually was armed this time, and he shot the congressman right above the left eye. And he made no attempt to get away, or he admitted to the shooting right away. Now, they expected Congressman Tawby from Kentucky to live, but he didn't. Kincaid was charged with murder, and it sort of was one of the early things, there were a lot of them, that perpetuated Kentucky to be seen as a violent state. But this was one of them. We had another congressman we talk about in the book that was in a duel with another congressman and killed another congressman, a Kentucky congressman did. That's a very interesting story that I probably won't talk much about, but it's in the book. So the trial took place. Kincaid was found innocent, and later he came up to Cincinnati and was a reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer. What's interesting is years ago, I used to travel to D.C. a lot for work. And one time I was there, I had time, I went over to the Capitol, and a friend of mine was taking me around. He took me to this spot, and you can still, to this day, today, if you go to D.C., you go on a congressional tour, find this, but Tawby's blood stain still is in the marble. I mean, you can see it on on this set of steps. And it's sort of a fascinating place to find because it's got such Kentucky history. This is a person, it's not a great photo. I'm not a great photographer at all, as you can tell. But this is Thomas Page. Thomas Page was the first appointed auditor of the state of Kentucky and the last elected, he was the last appointed auditor of the state of Kentucky. And in 1850, when we did the new Constitution, he was the first elected. Well, what did he do? He stole money. He stole a whole bunch of money. So there's an interesting chapter about him. The more interesting chapter that John wrote is about Honest Dick Tate. You might have heard of Honest Dick Tate before. He actually got the name Honest Dick after he stole money from his stuff. So, he was just known as Dick Tate before, but then he stole money and they called him Honest Dick Tate. But I think a photo of him will come up. But I wanted to point out, I wanted to go to this person. And this is possibly one of the, in terms of politics, one of the most famous names in Kentucky. This is William Campbell Preston Breckinridge. And he was born in 1837. He initially wanted to be a doctor, but then he studied law. He married his first wife, Lucretia Clay, and guess who her father was? Henry Clay. And she died in 1860, and then in 1871 he married Isa Deschamps, and guess who her father was? The ex-governor, who was part of his son. Not that that's important, but following the war, what happened was he was a Southerner, and he was for the Confederacy during the war. And then afterwards, he denounced his pro-Confederacy and really advocated for racial equity, which was this complete hypocrisy on his part. He was elected to Congress, and he very well could have been the Speaker of the House. In fact, right away, people thought of him as a candidate for the Speaker of the House. And I say he was hypocritical because he was very prudish. He had just ridiculous opinions about women. I mean, he, in a speech to the Bourbon County Women's College, he said, "Chastity is the foundation, the cornerstone of human society, and it rests on the foundation of government." And he once was quoted as saying that women must be pure and should avoid useless handshaking, promiscuous kissing, needless touches, and all exposures. Well, guess what? He was a hypocrite because then he wound up having an affair with Madeline Pollard. I will show you her picture in a minute. But Pollard, well, I'll go and show it to you because I'll talk about it. Pollard brought suit against Breckinridge in 1893, claiming that he had been her mistress since 1884 when she was 17 years old. And she asked for $50,000 in damages, which is a lot of money. So the suit she brought was for breach of promise, claiming he had offered to marry her after his wife's death. And when she died in 1892, he married somebody else. And so she brought a suit. And during the affair, she gave birth to 2 children and had a miscarriage of another from the congressman. And this was a national trial and didn't shine a great light on Kentucky, but it was known nationwide through the newspapers. And Pollard was really, there's a whole book just on Pollard that was written by Patricia Miller, but she says in there that Pollard was very committed to challenging sort of the different standards that existed at the time for men and women. And she really tried to clue people into how Breckinridge was able to get away with having a mistress, and that there was a real double standard, and that women were treated vastly different than men. Well, the odds of her winning this suit were pretty much nil, but she did. She won this suit in the 1890s, and they gave her $15,000. And he ran for, I don't even have another picture of him. No, he ran for Congress again, and despite that, he only lost by 255 votes. And she had a good life after him. She wound up marrying a wealthy man that lived in Europe, traveled a lot. She lived all the way to after World War II. She died in late 1945. Whereas he's buried in Lexington Cemetery, and he died in 1904. So, but it's a very interesting case. This is actually Honest Dick Tate, and I'm not going to go into a lot about that because I didn't write this chapter. My co-author did, and it's such a fascinating case. But he wound up stealing a whole lot of money from Kentucky, and millions in essence. Eventually, he just one day when the heat started coming down on him, he just got on a train and carrying a whole bunch of gold. And the last time anyone ever saw him was in Cincinnati. And then he was gone. There were rumors that he was seen in the Caribbean. And some of the strongest ones were that he was seen in China. But he was never seen again. No one knows what happened to him or the money. So it's a very interesting case. I mentioned to you, and I just thought I'd touch on it very quickly, that there was a congressman, as I said, got into a duel with another congressman, and the Kentucky congressman was actually the one who killed the other person. One thing is, it's not all state government. I mean, we've had auditors who've been very corrupt. As I mentioned, we had an auditor who was corrupt. It was the last appointed and the first elected. And the auditor in Kentucky history back then was the most powerful position next to the governor, because they had to collect all revenue, and they had to approve all expenditures, or at least do a warrant on all expenditures. And that led to a lot of corruption. And still today, the auditor's position is elected. One thing in the book that I also talk about. Oh, this is Goebel. Well, let me do that until I get to my next one. The Goebel assassination is one of the great chapters in this book. I mean, we really go into depth about all of the politics that led to the assassination of William Goebel, who, as you know, is from Covington, Kentucky. And he to this date is the only governor assassinated in United States history. We've had one come close, and he only served, a day or two. But it's a really interesting chapter in the book. This is a statue of Goebel. These pictures are all in the book. That statue, which is great. And he's buried in Frankfort Cemetery. And so there's a few things here on the election. And a lot of this election had to do with railroad interests and various things. This actually shows, if you ever go down to Frankfort, I've always liked this spot. This is the old Capitol in Frankfort, which maybe you've seen before. But that little plaque right there at the bottom, that's where Goebel was shot. And you can find that spot in Frankfort if you just go over by the old Capitol, you walk up. And then over here in this white space would have been the Secretary of State's office. And that's where the shot came from. One thing, this is John Wayland, and that's Paul Barth. Didn't head of myself. The Wayland brothers, we have a little section in the book about local corruption, and it's not necessarily state. The Wayland brothers ruled Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky, in the 1890s up to the early 1900s, was probably the most corrupt city in America. I mean, that might be a little bit of an overstatement again with Chicago and all that kind of stuff. But, it was a very corrupt city, and we talk about the boss system. I know many of you may be familiar with Boss Cox in Cincinnati, who ran Cincinnati. And in fact, in my History Lover's Guide to Cincinnati, there's a picture Boss Cox's grave over in Spring Grove Cemetery. But there's a street in Cincinnati downtown, which is a building, used to be a bar, where he held court. Very few of the bosses really held court at City Hall, because a lot of times they weren't even elected officials, you know. And so Boss Cox in Cincinnati is an example of what the Whalens were like in Louisville. And an interesting thing is, you know, in my Kinder book, I talk about corruption in Covington. And Covington was one of the first cities, probably the first city in Kentucky, and one of the first cities nationwide to adopt the city manager form of government to fight corruption. Cincinnati was one. Covington was 1929, I think. And then Cincinnati, surprisingly, was just slightly after that. In Louisville, you know, it holds a unique place, and the book goes into this, for election fraud. There's a lot of election fraud that takes place. And Louisville, believe it or not, was the first place to make the secret ballot, or it was called the Australian ballot, but it's a secret ballot, legal and required. Before that, the secret ballot was adopted in Louisville, the paper would print a ballot. It would pre-fill in who you're voting for. You would cut that out, take it, and drop it in the voting box. I mean, that's how they do it. The Whalens did all kinds of tricks. They would put a moving precinct on a train between two wards if one of the wards was not a machine ward. And so if too many people were voting from that ward, they would move the train. And so that you know, those people couldn't vote. I mean, they did stuff like that all the time. The Democratic Party and the boss machine had tons of money. For example, a month before the election, I don't remember how much money, but it was a ton of money. The day after the election, they had no money in their accounts. What do you think they did with the money? They bought votes. And something like the vast majority of precinct workers in Louisville were city employees. City employees didn't go to work on election day, and they went out and made sure that you voted a certain way. There was also a rule in Louisville, something, to vote you had to be home for 2 nights in a row before the election. And then they would come and talk to you and stuff like that. Ironically, the secret ballot really never became legal in the United States. It was required until like 1925 or something like that. But they had a place. Well, the Whalens were not elected people, but they had a burlesque theater. Like Boss Cox was in a bar, they were in burlesque, you know, theaters and stuff. So eventually they went too far in the 1900 election, and they put up a candidate named Barth, B-A-R-T-H, Paul Barth, and he actually won a crooked election, but it was so crooked, eventually the judge, a judge actually threw it out, surprisingly. And then he eventually, because of all the criticism he got for being a machine candidate, he committed suicide not long after the election. So Louisville eventually got rid of all the fraudulent election, like most people did. So let me see what my next. This was the highway commissioner for Kentucky. He was a congressman, but he became highway commissioner. And I don't know, let's say 75% of Kentucky's revenue at the time, early last century, was highway money. As we transitioned to cars and stuff like that, we had a lot of dollars. There was a federal transportation bill that was created by Congress, I think I want to say 1921. And he controlled highways in Kentucky. And he controlled all of the money, and we know going up into the 1980s probably that highway contractors probably had a little bit of the fix to give Kentucky contracts. I mean, Kentucky divided the state out, and you had to make, in Kentucky's history, you had to make contributions to the Democratic governors. Kentucky's changed, you know, not that the party necessarily cleans you up or anything, but we used to be called the detour state because he would build roads. You didn't know where you were going. There was no rhyme or reason why roads went anywhere in Kentucky. So nationally, we were called the detour state because he did roads based on, you know, politics. He would take Kentucky road money, give it to a local banker, usually about $25,000, let him hold that money for several years with no interest, and then that way the banker could do with whatever they want, and then eventually they'll build a road with it in that county or something. So, let me see what I'm not going to get into that. This relates to the Bob Schrage, and I apologize. This is a scandal that my co-author actually was heavily involved in during the time, and he has written the definitive in this book, the definitive piece on the Bob Schrage scandal, and it's Bob Schrage, it's business, occupation, and professions, and then the Trot was related to the horse racing industry, and it was, I don't know, many people remember this scandal from 25 years ago, and it was a major scandal, and it brought down lots of people, and it led to reform of Kentucky's ethics law. And she, her name was Garrett, but she's an interesting person because she's on tape taking money and saying she could deliver favors and all of that. But what I wanted to point out before, I don't know how much time I have, I know you got a busy meeting, but I wanted to talk just briefly about Kentucky, the violence that Kentucky was we'll say Kentucky was very neutral or pro-North. Kentucky never left the Union during the Civil War. But after the Civil War, it was very pro-Southern. Its tendencies, its sympathies were with Southerners. Kentucky was opposed to the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which ended slavery, gave certain protections to former slaves, and various things. Kentucky didn't even adopt two of those amendments till the 1970s and stuff like that. Well, Kentucky became a very violent state, and we talk in the book a little bit about that violence. And some of it is related to, I mean, Kentucky had probably 150 lynchings up until 1890. There was, a lot of we did not want slaves to have the rights in Kentucky that the federal government was espousing after the Civil War. So there's a lot of violence there. And in Kentucky, as that sort of died down, we had, maybe 1885, that sort of decreased. Then we had other violence, Klan, think Hatfields and McCoys and stuff like that. So Kentucky it just had a reputation as a very, violent state, and we had congressmen killing each other, and all this kind of stuff. So, and we also were very violent in the sense, and I'll do one other person. This guy here is very interesting. He is one of the most evil people in Kentucky history. And I'll find my notes on it. He was the butcher of Kentucky, we would call him, because his name was Stephen Burbridge, the butcher of Kentucky. He was, after Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, and he allowed the military to arrest people. But this guy took it to all kinds of extremes. He once said, he was pro-Union, obviously, that for every time a Confederate sympathizer killed a Union person, we're going to yank 4 Confederate people out of prison and execute them on the spot in a public thing. in a public spot. One time, they executed 14 Southern sympathizers at one time. And, he just went after anybody who was opposed to the reforms of the, of the North. And, it was very ineffectual, he was, in terms of, stopping guerrilla warfare. Kentucky was turning into a violent state. It did not want to get rid of slavery, as I said. I mean, it opposed to the elimination of slavery in Kentucky. There was one law, it was interesting. There was a federal law that said, that if someone was freed, if they served a slave, if they served in the Union Army and stuff, and they were freed, then their wife and the children were also free. Well, Kentucky fought that law, saying, "Well, we don't recognize marriage for slaves, so that law doesn't apply to us." I mean, it was amazing the level of violence Kentucky had after the Civil War, surprisingly after being so neutral. So, I'm going to stop there. I mean, there's a lot in the book that I didn't cover and stuff, but I thought I'd open it up to questions, comments, thoughts, and whatever. We had, we'll close on the Bob Schrage scandal hit home here in Boone County. I mean, a legislator here in Boone County was right in the middle of that scandal and went to jail. So that's an interesting thing. But political reform under Brereton Jones, who was governor, really took off, and they created one of the most comprehensive laws. And a great legislator who I worked with very closely was a guy named Jim Callahan from Campbell County. And Jim led the efforts to create local government ethics ordinances, and required every local government in the state has to have an ethics board. And so Kentucky has some of it, but there hasn't been an indictment or really a corruption of a state official since that. However, there has been some modern scandals. There was a hiring scandal in the Fletcher administration. Richie Farmer, a very disappointing case, who was a hero in Kentucky as a basketball player, just had a very, very corrupt terms as an agricultural commission. Martin Lane Collins' husband was found guilty of contract steering. There's just a lot of those things that still happen in modern homes. So, I think I'll stop there just for the sake of you got a meeting. But any questions or comments or thoughts?
I have a comment I'll share with you.
Yeah.
My dad was in Louis Nunn's kitty corps, is what he called them.
Yeah.
He had this group of young men that worked in his cabinet. My father was one of them. He was a young, was a clerk. He clerked for Louis Nunn, and then he became a cabinet member. And when Bobby Kennedy came to visit Appalachia, my dad, as part of Louis Nunn's cabinet, which was Republican run, and of course Bobby Kennedy was a Democrat, took it upon himself to direct the press to the wrong airport so that nobody would be there when Bobby showed up.
Wow, some good
There's
dirty
my
tricks.
scandal. Family scandal.
Oh, there's some great dirty tricks there. Yeah.
Nothing fun.
Absolutely. Well, any other questions? Or
Is there any discussion in your book about the George Ratherman scandal?
I think we may mention in passing, but we primarily focused on statewide impact. Yeah. The only exception was that boss stuff, some of the local bosses. And that was, really statewide. Although the thing you bring up is a fascinating story. So, anything else? Well, thank you. I appreciate it.